He drove nails into his thigh every time he heard a woman's voice behind the monastery walls. In the winter of 1498, at the monastery of St. Sava, near Turin, there was a sharp increase in cases of self-harm among the brethren. A report by the apothecary, submitted to Prior Domenico del Vecchio, states that in December alone, more than 17 liters of vinegar were used to wash open wounds, and at least 38 hemp bandages were used per day. The bandages did not have time to dry. There was a smell of sour blood and mouse fat. The abbot of the monastery, Father Alfonso di Retticelli, the last representative of an ancient family of Sienese judges, had been suffering for 13 years from dark visions, disturbing dreams, and pain in the back of his head. According to the recollections of Chaplain Salvatore, he often woke up screaming, "They are coming without flesh, and I recognize them by their eyes." His bed was often soaked with sweat, down to the straw mattress. In January, after winter mass, he did not get out of bed. A doctor from Turin, Francesco Bellini, summoned at the insistence of the monastery's secular patron, the Marquis de Mora, examined him and concluded that the abbot's entrails are thinning and flowing like oil from burnt bread. Traces of multiple ulcers on the inner surface of the thigh, traces of stab wounds on the abdomen, and traces of burns on the tongue were recorded. His urine was cloudy and black. The smell from his mouth was described as a mixture of rotten almonds and incense. Visits were restricted from January 4th. Food was served through a shutter. He drank almost no water, but often poured it over himself in silence. His body became sticky, his skin hot and sluggish, and an ulcer with crusty edges opened on the back of his head. Records have been preserved by Benedetto, a servant who helped Father Alfonso in his final weeks. He noted that the abbot began to demand that he be brought a cane and an iron whip with hooks. On nights when female pilgrims stayed at the monastery, Father Alfonso was laid on a wooden millstone and tied with leather straps. At his own request, he claimed that this was the only way to resist his inner urge leading to damnation. In mid-January, the skin on his shoulder blades began to darken. The doctor recommended washing with salt water, rubbing with arsenic ointment, and morning enemas of dill and goat's milk. The latter led to severe bloody stools and a drop in blood pressure. The pharmacist's testimony includes the phrase, "After the procedure, the abbot's face became whiter than his cassock, and his lips turned blue from breathing." By January 16th, convulsions began, described as arching of the back and crunching in the joints, as if his body were being pulled with ropes. His hands clenched into fists, his nails dug into his palms. On the 5th day of the seizures, one of the monks, Brother Giulio, could not bear it any longer and tried to pour a decoction of poppy seeds into the dying man's mouth. He spat out the liquid and croaked, "I must feel everything I deserve." After that, Father Alfonso was never seen again in daylight. All procedures were moved to the evening. Rumors circulated that women were being brought to his chambers, but this was never confirmed. Nevertheless, Brother Marcello claimed to have heard soft female sobbing coming from behind the door, but the abbot was alone at the time. The words, "blood for thought, flesh for a glance," were scratched on the wall of his cell. On the 24th day of his illness, the abbot's skin began to peel off his face. The doctor explained this as the effect of arsenic and fever. His forehead burst open and a cloudy liquid oozed out. He was not given communion. He refused. He did not want anyone to touch his lips. He continued to pray, lying in filth. One of the servants wrote in a note, "It smelled like the cell of a sinner who died alone among dirty rags and moldy bread crusts." By early February, the monks were already whispering as they passed his door. The room was filled with flies. 2 rats, attracted by the smell, were killed near the abbot's bed. One of them, according to the brother healer, tried to gnaw through the bandage on the sick man's leg. An autopsy was not performed. According to records before his death, the abbot requested that his body not be touched and that he be buried in the same clothes he had worn for the last 3 days. The priors of neighboring monasteries refused to attend the funeral. The coffin was carried not by monks, but by peasants who had been paid in advance. Only 6 people attended the funeral. After Father Alfonso's death, drastic changes took place in the monastery. A new abbot, known for his closeness to the papal court, was sent from Rome. Some old books were burned. The crucifixes were replaced. 2 monks, especially close to the former abbot, were taken away at night and never seen again. The report of the Bishop of Turin states, "From now on, the monks will fast in silence and repent without blood." When Brother Gennadius lost the ability to stand from constant self-flagellation, his legs were black to the knees and the skin on his heels peeled off like bark. He was cared for by a junior novice, John of Antwerp, who was tasked with removing the blood-stained bandages, gathering the shreds of flesh from the stone floor, and smearing his festering wounds with sulfur ointment prepared in the abbot's quarters. Joan did not complain. In his diary, later found in the monastery archives marked "unfit for reading," he wrote, "He moaned, but with every breath he thanked the Lord, and I heard his lips whisper, 'Cleanse me with fire.'" Abbot Sebastian ordered that Brother Gennadius be deprived of water, bread, and even a candle. He believed that the glow of the flame awakened memories of lust in him. In darkness is the blessed womb of repentance, he said, and ordered that the emaciated body be wrapped in sackcloth so that it would not tempt even the angels. During those weeks, 3 other brothers fell dead in the refectory, 1 from starvation, 2 from internal bleeding after a brutal cleansing procedure involving a glass tube inserted into the intestine. The healer Ruprecht, a former butcher from Strasbourg, commented on what he saw. "They wanted to pull the filth out of themselves, but they pulled out their intestines, for the flesh is always stronger than the will." The chronicles of the monastery of St. Matthew in Alsace, which were kept in an iron-bound oak box, contain a handwritten note by the chaplain. "The abbot turned pale, avoided speech, stood alone at night in the ashes of burnt sheets, and the walls of his cell were covered with moisture, as if from the breath of the dead." He said that carnal spirits were stealing in the smoke, and therefore ordered a pit to be dug in the middle of the courtyard to dump the clothes in which anyone had ever looked at a woman. 3 icons were thrown into the same pit, on which, according to the abbot, the face of the Virgin Mary was painted with the intention of provoking impure thoughts. According to the brothers, in recent weeks, live pigeons had begun to disappear from the monastery. One of the brothers, the elder Bruno, found bloody feathers and dried bones in the cell, where Brother Lazarus, who suffered from bouts of repentance, lived. He refused to answer, but his room smelled of smoke and vinegar. Later, charred remains of small animals were found in the cellars. The monks believed that the smell of burnt flesh would drive away temptation. There they also found a tiny amulet with the inscription, "I desire, therefore I rot." When the Inquisitor Orlando of Besançon arrived at the monastery with a secret mission from the Bishop of Metz, the gates were not opened until sunset. The envoy was struck by the smell of rot and sour blood coming from the stone embrasures. The next day, having made his way inside, under the pretext of confession, he wrote in his report, "On 3 brothers, I saw wounds that I could not recognize. They did not bleed. but exuded a grey liquid. And when I asked what they had smeared on themselves, one of them replied, "Our own semen, in order to return the temptation to ourselves." In his report, the Inquisitor added that some of the walls inside the cells were covered with gouges in which fragments of teeth protruded. Rumors of what was happening reached the Duke of Lorraine, to whom the monastery had been subordinate since the time of his great-grandfather. The Duke sent his clerk with orders to stop all arbitrary torture and report on the condition of the monks. The scribe, whose name was Clement, arrived at the monastery accompanied by 2 hired guards and described in his notes, "I had barely entered the cloister when I felt sick. The air was heavy, as if I were in a meat pit. The brother who met us had bulging eyes, and when he smiled, something green poured out of his mouth." Clement demanded an audience with the abbot, but he could not be lifted from his bed. His skin was so stretched over his bones that when they tried to turn him over, his side cracked. According to the servant, the abbot, Sebastian, whispered in his sleep, "They are touching me again." Women in skins, their hands covered in candle wax, and the Lord does not answer. Doctors from Tula, who were called late, diagnosed general tissue necrosis in the lower abdomen, foul-smelling necrosis in the sacrum, and paralysis of the limbs. During the autopsy, after his death, a fist-sized stone was found in his kidney, and his internal organs were found to be fused together and completely blackened. But the abbot's death did not put an end to the torment. The brothers declared him a saint and began to keep bandages with his blood as relics. The survivors, only 18 of them, refused to leave the monastery and continued their exhausting fast, insisting that the flesh in us is still moving, and we must finish it off. When the body of Abbot Sebastian was carried out of his cell, the smell was so strong that 3 brothers lost consciousness and one vomited on the stone slabs. It was impossible to dress the corpse. The skin slipped off at the slightest touch. They wrapped him in a canvas cover, but it quickly became saturated with a murky liquid flowing from the abdominal area. According to Brother Isaiah, smoke was coming out of the deceased's ears, and his skin was blackened, as if burned by coals. The funeral service was conducted in semi-darkness. None of the brothers dared to sing. Only the old bell, splattered with fat from the burned corpses, rang hollowly. 7 men carried the coffin, but one brother fell on the 3rd step, crying out that he felt sin. Penetrating through the wood, he was taken away and never returned. The abbot's body was buried in the catacombs under an old wine cellar in a niche where lepers had once been hidden. The stone was blocked by hand. No one dared to bring lime. Immediately after the funeral, the monks split up. The elders, those who had been with Sebastian from the beginning, declared that his death had not completed the path of purification. One of them, Brother Thomas, cut off his genitals right in the confessional. The bleeding continued for a long time. He survived, but could no longer speak. The younger ones, the novices and recent postulants, began to leave at night, making their way to the back gate, where peasants summoned by their relatives were waiting for them. In just 1 week, 10 people disappeared from the monastery. Inquisitor Orlando, having received a second order from the bishop, returned with 3 doctors and 2 notaries. He demanded a complete search of the cells, books, supplies, and all remains. The brothers locked themselves in the temple and refused to speak. The Inquisitor ordered the gates to be broken down. Inside, they found 6 bodies, 3 of them naked, 2 with their hands and feet bound. All had been dead for more than 2 days. One of the bodies had an inscription burned into its chest. "The flesh speaks through dreams." The remaining brothers were gathered in the refectory. Of the 39 men, 21 were still alive. All showed signs of torture, festering wounds, ulcers on their stomachs, mutilated ears, and burned eyes. 2 could not walk. 1 was blind. One of the doctors, named Tadeusz, wrote, "I saw a man eating his own fingernails, mixing them with a paste of flour and blood. They smeared it on their stomachs to quell their passion." The interrogations were conducted quietly. The inquisitor did not allow any noise, believing that whispering better reveals sin. Under torture, Brother Chrysostom confessed that he had prayed several times, imagining the image of one of the peasant women who had brought bread. He claimed that he had burned his tongue with a hot iron hook, so that he would never utter her name again. His tongue was indeed burned. The confiscated books showed that the abbot kept a private journal in which he recorded the flashes of sin he observed in each monk. There were names, dates, places, smells, even dreams. Entries about Brother Gennadius were particularly frequent. Today he trembled again in the presence of a candle. The light must be removed. The skin on his thigh has begun to rot. This is a sign. At the bottom was a note. If he lives to see spring, let him die of self-flagellation. It will be his baptism. Orlando ordered the monastery to be closed. Brother Lazarus was the last to be taken away. He could no longer move. His skin was peeling, even when he breathed. He whispered, "I don't want to be among women in hell." He died on the way. His heart stopped after the 3rd attack caused by frostbite. The doctors could do nothing. There were no veins left in his body through which opium or laxatives could be administered. The monastery gates were sealed with lead, and above the entrance was written, "Rest in peace, you who rejected the flesh." Guards were subsequently posted there to prevent the peasants from stealing the relics. However, 2 months later, one of the peasants sneaked in at night and took out a blood-stained piece of the abbot's clothing. He wrapped it in a cloth and swore that he had stopped having lustful dreams. A week later, he died of blood poisoning. His hand turned black up to his shoulder. The Inquisition used the events in Alsace as an example. Reports were sent throughout the district stating that carnal thoughts lead to the decay of the body. The Bishop of Metz ordered these records to be read in 42 parishes. He wrote, "We will not forbid desire, but we will show its consequences on a rotting body and silent fear." They died without sin, but also without salvation. 10 weeks after the monastery was closed, the trials began. The Order of St. Michael insisted on opening an investigation not only against the dead, but also against those who had stained the fabric of the church with their silence. The surviving monks were brought before the bishop's court in Metz. 16 men, most of them with speech, vision, or mobility impairments. 2 were carried on stretchers. All were so emaciated that, according to the description of notary Pierre Lacroix, their skin rang like parchment, and their bodies cast no shadow at noon. No direct accusations of witchcraft were made, but almost every interrogation was accompanied by references to unclean images that entered their dreams, were caused by fever, or appeared after self-flagellation. Roland d'Avignon, a physician who was allowed to see the monks, wrote, "The organs of most of them were destroyed. 7 had purulent inflammation of the lungs. 5 had gangrene in the genital area. 1 brother cut out his tongue, another his left eye, and a third the nail plates on both hands. 1 sewed his mouth shut before the trial." The interrogations were conducted with the windows closed so that the smell of decay would not interfere. Inquisitor Orlando, who arrived in person, insisted that the monks had become corrupt within their own faith and sought purification not through humility but through pain, which itself became a form of temptation for them. During the interrogation, Brother Paphnouti confessed, "I conjured up the image of a woman to kill him, first with a candle, then with a needle, then with meat, but he kept coming back." According to the copyist, he tried several times to tear off his own ear. At the same time as the trial, the remains were exhumed under a pressure from the clergy and for the purpose of preparing a medical report. The autopsy of the abbot Sebastian was carried out secretly in a burial vault. The body had decomposed so badly that the autopsy turned into the removal of rotting flesh. The skull was partially empty. The brain had disintegrated into a foul-smelling liquid. The lungs were filled with dark, oily mucus. The stomach was completely covered with ulcers. A clot of black flesh, resembling wax in consistency, was found in the kidney area. Based on the results of the autopsy, Dr. Guillaume de la Tour stated, "Death did not occur instantly. Decay had been going on for at least 3 weeks. The organs continued to break down while he was still conscious. The man suffered and saw himself rotting." He also noted that the abbot had burn marks on his stomach, possibly caused by cauterization. At the same time, there were scars from a rope in the groin area. Doctors suggested that he had tightly bandaged his body to hold the flesh together. Within a week after the autopsy, a rumor spread in Metz that the body had no heart. This claim was supported by 2 monks who were present during the embalming. One of them showed a notch on a wooden box in which, according to him, an organ, black as coal and dry as bone, had been placed. This box disappeared. Later, it was presumably sold in Reims as a relic of a saint who died of sin. The church sought to quell the unrest. A public mass was organized at which the archbishop read a message. Suffering does not purify the flesh unless it leads to submission. They wanted to die, but they forgot that death does not release you without a blessing. Immediately afterwards, an order was issued. All monasteries in the region were required to hand over their account books describing the measures of self-punishment. More than 50 brothers throughout Lorraine and Alsace were temporarily suspended from ministry. The peasants did not forget the monastery. In the fall, they began to gather at its walls. Some prayed, some brought their children, believing that the dead monks could quell their lustful nature. One woman tied her son to the monastery door, doused him with water, and left him there overnight. In the morning, the child was shivering, his chest covered with blisters. He died 2 days later. The woman said, "He saw Sebastian. He whispered at night." The building itself began to collapse. Water seeped into the basements. The arches were covered with mold, and worms appeared on the floor. At the end of winter, the south nave collapsed. Then the archbishop gave the order: demolish it to the ground, grind the stone, burn the soil, let the memory die with the blood. But the memory did not die. In secret schools and underground groups of believers, letters and notes began to appear, referring to the path of the abbot Sebastian as true purification through death. One of the treatises found in the possession of a priest in Toulouse read, "Whoever wants to kill the woman in himself must die a man." The church declared it heretical and burned the author in the main square. However, even today, notes can be found in the memoirs of some cardinals. Use Sebastian's measure if he does not obey. In the spring, when the ruined walls of the monastery were razed to the ground and the ashes of the burned robes still lay in the wind, a second wave of investigations began, this time within the church hierarchy. Letters to the papal see in Reims reported that the disease of fear and pain that originated in Lorraine may be contagious. Several priests in different provinces reported night touches and an inability to think. without piercing themselves with needles. An internal memorandum was drawn up proposing that all references to bodily deprivation as a means of expelling lust be removed from theological treatises. Moreover, a secret confiscation of books describing episodes of voluntary self-flagellation began. However, these belated measures did not stop the idea from spreading. It turned out that before the fire in the monastery, Brother Sebastian had been keeping records, secretly from the abbot, in a forged hand. He compiled a book of abominable visions, in which he recorded names, dates, and visions of the flesh. The book disappeared, but excerpts from it circulated among monks in Trier, Lyon, and Prague. These texts described how the fire of desire sprouts in the body and how it can be burned from within. One passage read, "If you see a woman, extinguish her with the face of the Savior. If there is no image, carve one into your skin. If the pain gives you no rest, lock yourself in it." Doctors who were allowed to examine the copyists of these texts found traces of numerous puncture wounds, burns, and symbols carved into their foreheads and chests. One of them died of blood poisoning. Another went mad and tried to stab himself in the eye with a pen. At a secret council in Rome, a phrase was uttered that found its way into a letter from one of the cardinals. "We have discovered not heresy, but a mirror." It was a moment of recognition. Behind the strictness of the vows, the execution of heretics, and the ritual of fasting lay the same flesh that they had tried to burn out. The body of Abbot Sebastian never found peace. After the autopsy, his remains were scattered among various burial places. The heart, if it really existed separately, disappeared. According to a report by a pharmacist from Metz, the skull was sold as a symbol of abstinence and hung in a hospital, where an epidemic of festering ulcers soon broke out. It was discarded. It changed hands several times before disappearing. The monastery's archives were sorted and hidden in a special fund, to which only a select few had access. The testimony of one of the surviving monks was also preserved there. He said, "We were not afraid of women. We were afraid that our own desire lived inside each of them. We wanted to kill him, but we killed ourselves, and not completely." A year after these events, the archbishop, who had ordered the demolition of the monastery, fell ill and died in agony. His insides began to rot while he was still alive. Witnesses said that he called out Sebastian's name in his delirium, begged for forgiveness, and scratched his chest. His death gave new impetus to rumors that a certain filth had returned and was now penetrating the episcopate. The church decided to silence the matter, but the memory remained. The people called him the cursed shepherd, not as a punishment, but as an example. Simple women left herbs and bandages at the ruins of the monastery. Young men came secretly to pray for the body that does not ask, but burns. The shadows of former monks were seen near the old ditches, where water used to flow for ablutions. Some claimed to hear whispers, "Inside the fire, there is peace." Thus ended the history of the monastery. But the history of fear of one's own flesh did not end.